So jump down. Okay, so I think I did pretty much Descartes for last time. Again, Descartes tried to get us out of the egocentric predicament by relying on his innate ideas, by trying to prove God, and trying to prove God is no deceiver by things like the ontological argument, which we already looked at. And then basically from there trying to show that if God really exists and is no deceiver, then when I think I see a real table here, if God made me such that He allowed the demons to deceive me about this, or I think there's a real table and there really isn't, then God would in some sense be a deceiver. And so if God's no deceiver, then He basically gets back the beliefs He questioned. Descartes does by saying that if God exists and is no deceiver, then I'm not deluded by a demon. I'm not sleeping. If I think there's a real table here, there really is. But Descartes' way out depended on citing his innate ideas, which the empiricists say are not there. Now, Locke didn't just say, I don't think there are any innate ideas, but there are 4 books to Locke's essay concerning human understanding, and he devotes most of the first book to trying to prove that there are no innate ideas as Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz thought there were, as the rationalists thought there were. So for Locke, then, when we come into this world, our mind is a blank tablet, a blank slate, a tabula rasa. And what writes on this tablet is basically experience. So if we know anything, it is not because we have innate knowledge like the rationalists thought, but for the empiricists, if we know something, it's because we acquired this knowledge after we were born from experience. And what we know are our ideas, and this is one of the things that leads to skepticism. This was called the theory of ideas, the idea that what the mind, what Locke calls the understanding, is immediately acquainted with is its own inner mental life, its own ideas. Well, if that's your view, and we can never get beyond those ideas to compare them with reality to see if they're accurately representing the world to us, then it's hard to justify philosophically the existence of anything other than the ideas. And so a view like Locke's led down the garden path to skepticism and to materialism. So for Locke, there are 2 sources of the knowledge we have. Sensation is basically what we know from what we experience with our 5 senses. Reflection has to do with introspection. The knowledge we gain about the operation of our own minds, about memory, about believing things, and whatever. So these are the 2 sources of our ideas. And for Locke, what I experience as a thing out there in the world, like say the desk here, is, as far as my experience of it, what I experience of the desk is a complex idea. And it is made up of the simple ideas that are ideas of its various properties or qualities. So I have a simple idea of a desk. And that, among other things, is comprised of its primary properties, that is, the size of the desk, its number, that it's one desk I'm talking about, properties like hardness, its size, its extension in space, its shape. All these Locke things are primary properties, and they're really in the desk, as the desk is out there in the world. But I know these properties because even though my mind is only acquainted with its own ideas, those ideas form inside me a mental picture, a picture of the desk that for Locke accurately represents the primary properties of the desk. Now, my experience of the desk, my complex idea, includes simple ideas of the primary qualities, but also simple ideas of its secondary properties, which include things like color, that part of it's blue plastic, it's brown, it's silverish, right? Sensations of heat and cold. If I touch the metal of the desk, I can feel that it's cold. All these properties, Locke says, are subjective. They're not really in the desk out there in the world. They're in us as we perceive the desk, but they are caused by the primary properties of the desk. Remember, Locke was a friend of Newton and Boyle's. He knew about atoms and molecules causing sensations of heat and cold in us, right? So the primary properties cause the secondary in us, but for Locke, they're entirely subjective. They are not properties of the desk as it appears in the world. So the desk has no color in the world, but it does have the shape it has, the size it has, the fact that it's extended and movable in space, and it has, it's one desk, it has number. Well, all these are the properties of the desk. And so Locke really gets us half the way to Berkeley. Because for Locke, what I experience as an object, as a material object, is just a combination of its primary and secondary properties. And for Locke, the primary properties really are out there. In other words, for Locke, there's a desk in the real world that actually has the size, the shape, the number, feelings of hardness, those primary properties that my subjective image of the desk tells me are in it. Now, for Berkeley, there is no independent object. There are only the ideas or sensations, and what I experience as a desk for Berkeley is just a collection of ideas, and ideas are mental. But for Locke, those ideas that I experience represent a real material thing. That's why Locke's view, what is indirect or representative realism? Well, that's Locke's view. That is that when I, say, perceive a desk, I have a mental image of the desk that that represents to me the properties that the desk really has out there in the real world. So which qualities are represented to us by resemblance? The primary properties. For instance, my subjective experience of the chalkboard here, my mental image is of something that is rectangular in shape. And that image and the rectangular image I have accurately represents the rectangular shape of the chalkboard as it is in the real world. Yes, the shape would be a primary property, right? Shape, number, motion, extension in space, hardness, these are primary properties. One way to think about the secondary is they usually relate to only one sense. Primary properties usually can be discerned with more than one sense. In other words, I can look at the computer monitor and see that it's rectangular, okay, with my vision. But if we were in a dark room, let's say this were a computer monitor and it was totally dark, and we thought, well, okay, is it an old-fashioned square computer monitor or is it a rectangular one? Well, I could feel along the edges of it, and the sense of touch would also tell me that it has the primary property of being rectangular. Whereas its black color is something I have to discern with only one sense, my vision, right? Or, the sense of touch tells me that this is cool to the touch. Sounds are heard. Smells are smelled. So the secondary property is like perceptions of color, smells, tastes, sounds. They usually relate to only one sense. And for Locke, those are entirely subjective. They're in us, not in things in the world. Well, the problem with a view like Locke's is Locke is very much where Descartes put us in the egocentric predicament. What Locke calls the understanding is like the seat of the soul, the part of you that is aware of your environment, of the world around you, of yourself, right? And what the understanding, what the mind immediately perceives, is only its own ideas. Well, for Locke, he's a glass is half full kind of guy. Some of those ideas really represent real qualities of objects in the world that exist, whether we're there to perceive them or not. But this kind of view does lead to skepticism, because if the only thing the mind ever knows is its own inner mental life, its own ideas, and it can never get beyond them to compare those ideas, its perceptions, with the real world to see if those ideas accurately represent the world or represent anything, then this leads to skepticism. It's very hard to justify the existence of anything beyond those ideas. And so Locke's view leads down the garden path to skepticism, and Berkeley knew this, and he didn't like the fact that a view like Locke's that puts a gap between what I immediately experience, my own inner mental life, my own ideas, and the world out there, leads to skepticism about the world out there. Plus, Berkeley thought that this view that things in the world can exist unperceived, that there's a world of material objects like that desk that can exist whether we're here or not, whether God's around or not. Berkeley saw this as a challenge to traditional Christianity. He was a very devout guy, and he thought if you allow people to believe that there can be a material world of objects that exist on their own, that don't need you or I around for them to exist, that certainly don't need God around, then why couldn't that lead to a view like Thomas Hobbes that only the material world exists? And if that's the case, then what happens to the soul? What happens to God if the only things that exist are matter? So Berkeley sees the belief in a material world as leading to skepticism and possibly to materialism in the philosophic sense, right? We have a common everyday use of the word materialistic, and we're talking about, Madonna being a material girl in the material world, materialistic being like the Real Housewives of X, where their whole life really revolves around keeping up with the Joneses and bettering them, getting a bigger house and more possessions. Yeah, that's one word, materialistic, but the philosophic word materialistic is the belief that only matter exists. There is no immaterial substance. There is only material things. Anything that we think is immaterial, connected with the mind, is just, in some sense, produced by or caused or related to the material body. So Berkeley sees this as a challenge to his faith, and so he wants to cut out the legs from under the stool of the people who believe in matter by adopting idealism or immaterialism, the view that only mental things exist, only minds and their perceptions. So this is what he means by esse percipi. To be is to be perceived. Now again, understand where he's coming from. Understand that for Berkeley, as for you and I mean, if I stopped you at the door and I said, well, watch out going in the room, because I know that there's a pain existing somewhere in the room and you don't want to experience it. You say, well, wait a second, you can't have just a pain existing in an empty room full of desks and chairs without... The only way a pain can exist is in a perceiver, somebody capable of feeling pain. Well, if you understand that, okay, a pain is just a sensation. Well, for Berkeley, every quality I experience as a property of a material thing is just a sensation. A sensation of glue, a sensation of weight, a sensation of hardness, a sensation of something that has particular shape and size. So Berkeley says if the qualities of what we think are houses, mountains, rivers are just sensations, isn't it absurd to think that a sensation can exist without perceiver? to feel or experience the sensation. So that's how we get to esse percipi. If what I experience as a des is just a conglomeration of sensations, and sensations can't exist without a perceiver, then the des can't exist unless it's being perceived by either you or I, or fortunately for Berkeley, God perceives these things when we're not here. So he comes out with a view that makes God absolutely essential to the whole scheme of reality. If to be is to be perceived, then we're perceiving either our own ideas or God's ideas. So that's how somebody like Berkeley can get to a claim that there's no material world and not be insane. I mean, Berkeley is entirely, in his right mind mentally. See, in other words, if hardness is just a sensation, then this, audiovisual cabinet is going to be just as hard if it's only mental as it would if material things existed, because hardness is just a property, just a sensation. A stone's going to be just as hard. Things aren't going to be hollow. So this is Berkeley's view. Anyway, so the argument for the mind dependency of ideas is that ideas like pain have to exist only in a perceiver, and if the qualities of a thing are just sensations or ideas, then they have to be perceived to exist. And so that means that a whole material thing its esse is percipi. Its existence is to be perceived by some mind or other. So for Berkeley, everything that exists is mental. It's either minds or ideas in minds. Well, now David Hume is a skeptic. Berkeley tries to say he's not a skeptic. I mentioned this before. He says, what's a skeptic but somebody who doubts of things? And Berkeley says, I'm not asking you to doubt the existence of a material world. I'm telling you straight up, there is no material world. That for him is beyond doubt. Whereas Hume is just going to try to say that if we only experience perceptions, our own inner ideas and impressions, we can never reason from them to the proposition that they are caused by real external material things outside us. So Hume says we should be skeptical about the existence of a material world. Not that he absolutely knows it doesn't exist, but that he has no good reason logically to think that it exists. So for Hume, there are really two classes of what he calls perceptions. For Locke, there are only ideas. The word perceptions serves for Hume the same function as the word idea does for Locke. Remember, for Locke, an idea is whatever we can experience is an idea, whatever we perceive. But Hume divides what we experience into two categories. The original sensory experiences that I have when I look at something and see it has a brown color like this desk, or when I feel it and feel that it's hard and cold to the touch. The original shape that, say, the blackboard over there has. Those he calls impressions. But then, from those experiences, I can recall them, right? I can turn my back on the blackboard and picture what it looks like. And that, to Hume, is an idea. Ideas exist in the memory and in the imagination, right? I mean, I could imagine a board like that, instead of being colored black, colored, say, white. I'm glad we're getting away from boards myself. The old-fashioned blackboards are much easier to write on. Anyway, so for Hume, our perceptions are divided into impressions and ideas, and the impressions are more vivid, lively than the ideas. In other words, suppose you had strawberry shortcake for dessert last night. Well, the original impressions that you had when you were eating it are very vivid, right? But now you could remember back on that. Remember, oh wow, that was a great strawberry shortcake, we had for dessert last night. But the ideas are much fainter, than the original sense experience. Now, there's a reason why he makes this distinction, and it has to do with his skeptical method and with his empiricism. Basically, what Hume as an empiricist is going to say is, in order for you to know what you're talking about as a philosopher, or in order for you to justify your claim that something exists, you ought to be able to trace the idea you have of something back to a previous impression. And if you can't, Hume is going to say, then you're justified in being skeptical about its existence. And maybe, if you can't trace your idea back to a previous impression, maybe you don't have a clear idea of what you're talking about. Now, what Hume does is, he uses this method to challenge things like a material substance as a material substratum that underlies perceivable qualities but isn't perceived. He challenges the self as a continuous soul that we can introspect. He says, I can't introspect and find the self. In other words, there's no impression of the self from which I get an idea. So he challenges our belief to exist even as a continuous self that carries our identity from one day to the next, much less as a self that's going to survive death. So he says concerning the soul, trace it back to a previous impression. Oh, you can't do that? Then you ought to be skeptical about it. Do you have any impression of a material substratum underlying the qualities, the perceptions you have of a desk? Hume says no. So you ought to be skeptical about the existence of a material thing. And I'm not going to ask you questions about what you see at the end of the video, what he says on causation and the problem of induction. But Hume says that, what do I see when I see two billiard balls contact one another? That the cause precedes the effect in time, and that the cause and the effect are related in space, they're contiguous. But do I see a necessary connection between the cause and its effect that would lead me to say that a similar cause is always necessarily going to produce the same effect? Hume says no. I don't see a relationship of a necessary connection between the cause and its effect, and so I can't justify the claim that causes are always going to produce the same effects. So that's Hume's skeptical method. He says, what should we do, when we hear a philosopher using a word like soul or material substance or necessary connection between causes and effect. He says we should always ask, Hume says, from what impression is that idea derived? And if you can't trace your idea back to a preceding impression, Hume would say you're using the word, but do you even have a clear idea what you're talking about? Plus, you can't justify by observational evidence the existence of the thing you're talking about. So you ought to be skeptical about it. Now, it's important to see that Hume, in other words, Hume would say, well, look, just because gravity has always worked in the past doesn't mean you can defend the claim that it's going to work in the future. But that doesn't mean that Hume would walk out a second floor or third floor window saying, well, maybe gravity isn't going to work this time. I should be skeptical about it. Well, no. Hume admits in his own everyday life, he's got to act and believe like everybody else. That we're in a real world of material objects, that cause and effect relationships hold. That he is the same person as the person who wrote the works he wrote in his younger days. But Hume says, as a philosopher, I cannot find a rational defense of these beliefs. I have to believe them because of my human nature. But he says I believe them on the strength of what I've been taught by custom. I believe them because it's part of my human nature to do so, but I don't have a rational justification for these beliefs. Basically, I believe them irrationally, is what he's trying to say. So that's Hume. And I don't know, we did utilitarianism so recently. Maybe I ought to ask is if there's something on the Millen utilitarianism part of the sheet that you want me to elaborate on, I can. Otherwise, we pretty much. Okay, we're just gonna go through Bentham and Mill, but there are things at the end of that utilitarianism PowerPoint that are not going to be on your test. Okay, don't worry about the distinction between act and rule utilitarianism, and I really didn't go into the criticisms that are normally brought against utilitarianism, just for lack of time. So I'm probably not going to say very much about that on the test. So the part that you see on this review sheet, how can act utilitarianism justify breaking a promise? and how is real utilitarianism different from it? Don't worry about that distinction. I should have X'd that out, and I didn't. But know the basics of what Bentham and Mill believed about hedonism, about the principle of utility, about quantity and quality of pleasures, the pluses and minuses of using a hedonistic calculus. Those are the kinds of things you ought to remember. Pardon?
Can you talk about the strengths and weaknesses of
Okay, I'm sorry about the what?
The strengths and weaknesses of Bentham's hedonistic calculus.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Okay. Well, basically, remember, Bentham thought initially that we could reason about pains and pleasures and in a very exact way. That we could actually, remember, you're weighing consequences. You're saying how much happiness versus unhappiness for all concerned is going to be produced if I do A. Okay, compare that with how much happiness or unhappiness for all concerned is going to be produced if I do B. That's the principle of utility. Act so as to produce for all concerned the greatest balance of happiness versus unhappiness, or the least amount of unhappiness versus happiness for all concerned. So Bentham thought we could actually assign exact values to the various pains and pleasures that people would have relating to a given situation, and that we could do the math, decide how many positive results versus negative results, and we'd come down on the side with the most positive and the least negative consequences. So in a hedonistic calculus, and you'll see there's a very practical problem, we would see what the values of the individual pains and pleasures are, and then do the math. Now the problem is in figuring out what a hedon is supposed to be. He thinks that we can talk about pains and pleasures like we can talk about temperature. We can talk about the temperature in this room quantitatively because we have a unit of measurement that we can apply to temperature, whether it's degrees Fahrenheit or degrees Celsius. He thought we could talk about exact numbers of hedons. A hedon plus one hedon is a unit of pleasure, minus one hedon is a unit of pain. But because they're subjective, there's no real objective way to assign an exact value to what counts as a hedon's worth of pleasure. So if you don't know what's going to count as one of something, as one hedon's worth of pleasure, how do you know how many hedons you have, right? Plus, you're talking about people's inner experiences. Plus, as a utilitarian, remember, all the consequences you're trying to weigh are things in the future. You're trying to project, like the uncle was trying to project, how much is my nephew going to enjoy the circus if I take him? How much am I going to be bored by it if I go? Versus how much am I going to enjoy the book if I read the book instead? How much is my nephew going to be disappointed if he doesn't go to the circus? So you're trying to predict future consequences within the real world is often hard to do. You know, so this is a criticism of utilitarianism, that it's hard to predict future consequences. But, so remember, for Bentham the word is quantity. He thinks we can talk about pleasures and pains and talk about only their quantity. Mill tries to introduce the notion of quality because people said utilitarianism is giving us too low a view of human nature if it says that the pleasures of a pig out there in the field eating slop, if the quantity's the same, is the same as the pleasure you might get from reading poetry like Maya Angelou or going to the symphony. And Mill says, no, utilitarians ought to worry about quality of pleasures too. We really don't have as low a view of human beings as our critics make us out to have, because quality is important. Okay, I don't want to make you late for your next class. If you came in after I called the roll, let me know. See you Wednesday. We'll do a little bit more review and